Hi, my name is Matt, and in this next series of videos we are going to kind of break away from the norm a little bit, and we are going to do an engine rebuild, but kind of a special one. We're going to do an extreme low budget rebuild. We're going to avoid the machine shop as much as possible and reuse as many parts as possible. The idea being, if you are considering an engine rebuild as part of your solution for a blown engine, then well, actually, to be honest with you, regardless, you really shouldn't do this. And I'll explain why in a little bit. This is not generally going to be a realistic option for most people, mainly because it's going to cost a lot more than you think. You're much better off getting a used engine in most cases. It's going to cost you a half to a third as much as even a budget rebuild. But the idea with this video is to show you what's involved in the rebuild, how to do much of the work yourself to avoid the machine shop fees, and also give you an idea of what is entailed. Is this something that you want to take on? You've probably seen other videos or read books about it and stuff. In real life, I can tell you it's not nearly as easy as turning a bunch of pages. So we're going to do a few recurring themes with this. One of them is a lot of calculation of the costs involved as we go along the teardown process and test things. Also, another recurring theme will be the meticulous nature that is required in an engine rebuild. You have to have an incredible amount of attention to detail, and that will be demonstrated in this video. Again, something you'll want to keep in mind if this is really something that you want to take on. And then kind of a third thing I'm going to do is I'm kind of in a bad mood because it's like 90 degrees and I've been working on this thing pulling out of this truck all day, and I'm going to kind of handle some of my negative commenters at the same time with some rather acerbic rebuttals. So should be fun, should be interesting. One of the nice things about an engine rebuild is that it doesn't matter whether the engine is from 1935 or 2007. For the most part, it's actually pretty identical. So if you understand the concepts of doing the engine rebuilding, whether it's a dual overhead cam or push rod or whatever, you'll find that pretty much once you strip an engine down, they all look the same. So kind of a good knowledge to have. So this engine right here, not that it matters again, because this is going to apply to many different types of engines. But this particular one is a Ford 352. Say what? Yeah, this one is from 1965. Take a look at the truck I pulled this thing from. So being acutely aware of the demographics of most of my subscribers, many of you guys, this is going to be right up your alley because you're a little bit, older than I am actually. Ha! But this is a 1965 Ford F100. But again, the principles that we're going to go over are going to be identical for virtually any engine. But pretty cool little truck, probably seen a lot better days. The engine certainly has. So let's start the teardown. And before we get into calculating any costs and everything, I'm going to show you with a teardown how I know that we need to rebuild this engine. Obviously, the most important thing before you take on a project is it necessary to do it. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and do that, because a lot of people are like, I don't want to do calculations on costs. I want to see bolts move and parts come off. Don't worry, my ADD friends, your time is now. So basically your penultimate validation is, and I already did this in this engine while it was still in the truck, but you pull the oil pan. In this case, I just rotated the engine over on the engine stand, but you can do this in the car. You pull the oil pan, you go to one of your piston rods that is furthest from the oil pump, because that usually gives you kind of the best indication of your worst case scenario, and remove one of the rod caps. There we go. And check the bearing underneath, and as we can see, there is almost no bearing material left on this bearing at all. We've got maybe a little bit up here, and we've also got some extremely deep gouges in here. What I usually do is a fingernail test. If I can catch on any machine surface with my fingernail, and even through the glove, I mean, this feels like sandpaper. Now, this is going to be one of our first concerns with our budget rebuild, because looking at that, I'm pretty safely concerned that the journal on the crankshaft is going to be scored, and if it fails the fingernail test, then we are going to have to resurface the crankshaft. We'll have to grind the crankshaft. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So we can see here, and yeah, this is very, very rough. And this is not unusual given the symptoms of this engine, which for those of you with ADD would not have stayed around long enough to listen to. But let's, now that we've confirmed that we definitely need a rebuild, and we're also going to at least be taking a crankshaft to the machine shop at best. We have some machine shop work. Let's see how this handles with our budget. But before I do that, we have to be very meticulous. When I put this rod cap back on, it has to go on exactly the same way that it came off. In other words, it makes absolutely every difference in the world whether I put it on this way or this way. And it goes on this way because when I took it off, I paid special attention to place it in orientation. So we're going to put that back on, and we can just loosely bolt this up for now because I'm really not worried about destroying the crankshaft at this point. And let me tell you some other symptoms that I noticed before I started digging in and pulling bearings out of the engine. Oh my God, you would not believe how heavy this engine is. There is definitely something to be said for aluminum engines. They are much lighter. This thing is noticeably the heaviest engine I've ever dealt with by far. So honestly, you might consider getting some help if you do this project. So anyway, that previous scene was for you Haynes manual jockeys. Haynes manual jockey is a negative derogatory term I give to the people that have turned far more pages in their Haynes manual than they have wrenches on an engine like this, and yet they think they know everything. So whenever I do anything different than what they saw in their Haynes manual, they give me a negative comment and tell me that I'm doing it wrong. So I've got news for you. You can take your Haynes manual and shove it in your butt, because we are going to so ignore that thing in this series. It's going to make you worried. Anyway, that said, let's look at some other things that were indications that this engine needed a rebuild. One of them is staring right at you here. Check this out. So if we notice under the rocker arm cover, there is absolutely no oil even pulled up in the corners or anything. It is absolutely completely bone dry. And this engine had very, very low oil pressure. A lot of people think oil pressure is from the oil pump, and that's partially true, but you have to have proper bearing clearances. It is your bearings, the things we just inspected that were almost non-existent, that actually create the oil pressure so it can reach the top of the engine. So when you have very low oil pressure, actually seldom is it the oil pump. It's usually because the bearings are worn, it does not allow oil pressure to build, and the top end of this engine has got no oil for quite some time. And there's also, of course, some obvious signs that are universal pretty much for engine rebuild. Engine knock, rod knock. If you have rod knock, don't even bother checking. If you have rod knock, and I've got a video that shows you how to check for rod knock, you can search my channel. You need an engine rebuild, you don't even have to look at the bearings. Another thing, when the oil on this engine was drained, it had many, many very fine glittery silver particles. Those silver particles that kind of look like a milkiness in the oil are the bearings. It's actually the bearing material that's in the oil. So if you change your oil, that's usually one of the first things I'll do on an oil change. I'll examine the oil. If it has metal glitter in it, pretty much we're done. We need a rebuild. But I'll verify it usually with the bearing test that we did earlier. And then, of course, a final thing with the need for an engine rebuild. Interestingly enough, this engine had no engine noise. It did not have a rod knock. It did not even have a rattle with the valves for whatever reason. But there was no engine noise with this. But one thing it did have, it had fairly low compression. And actually, one of the things that is a good sign, I'm hoping, for our very low budget rebuild is I'm actually less concerned about the cylinder heads. Because while the engine had very low compression, the lowest minimum spec for compression on this engine is 160 psi. This engine had 120 psi evenly on every cylinder, so I'm not worried about a warped head or something like that. And the other thing too is when I added oil to the rings by putting oil through the spark plug hole, most of you are probably familiar with that trick, especially if you read the Haynes manual, then if you get increased compression when you add oil to the rings, what that does is it seals up the rings better. So if you get increased compression, then that tells you the rings had to have been worn. When I did that test, I actually brought it up to over 165 psi, which tells me that the rings are definitely worn on this engine, but it also gives indication that the top end is probably sealed up pretty good and the valves are okay. So we'll inspect that, but it's kind of a promising sign. I also did a leak down test on the engine and it failed miserably with the leak down test. It had very, very high leak down. But again, when I added oil to the cylinder through the spark plug hole, and sealed up the rings, the leak down was actually in the good area. So again, showing that the head is probably sealed. I could detect absolutely no leak down through the valves or through the cooling system or anything, but particularly through the intake and exhaust valves, no detection of air from the leak down test. So this indicates that the heads at least are good, but there was tremendous amount of leak down. All of the leak down was through the oil pan, which means that it's going through the rings. Questions on the leak down test and everything, I've got a video on how to diagnose a used engine, and if you look up that video, it talks a lot about the leak down and compression tests. So what we are going to do at this point, right now, there are some things that are fixed on a rebuild, and here is my list of things that are non-negotiable on any engine rebuild, even if it's low budget. At the top is my labor rate, but we're going to, of course, need a gasket set. I found one. I use a company called Engine Tech. So if you're looking to do a real low budget rebuild, I don't think I would do this on a racing engine, but I've used these kits before from Engine Tech. They're very low cost, but they get the job done. So we'll need a rebuild set, which will include all the gaskets for the engine. We're going to need new rod bearings and main bearings, we know, on this engine. An oil pump. Regardless of what your rebuild budget is, you have to put a new oil pump into a new engine rebuild or even into a budget rebuild. We are going to definitely on this engine need a ring set at minimum. The piston rings are absolutely guaranteed to be worn. We're going to do some measurements to validate that, but we will need that. And of course, an oil change and coolant are necessary. We know we can add a machine shop fee for grinding the crankshaft. So that's going to be $120 more on our list. So we're already totaling up almost $500. The customer has a maximum, absolute maximum budget of $1,500. If we go over $1,500, that's going to be a big problem. So what our strategy is before we buy any of this stuff, before we take the crankshaft to the machine shop, we want to analyze every expense that will be involved in rebuilding this engine so we don't spend any money before we get a budget and then decide if we can go forward. So that's the strategy we're going to use. It's now time to start tearing down the engine. So your best place to start is working from the top down. So we're going to do this intake manifold first. And right now, I know that the Haynes manual jockeys are like, oh man, he's using power tools or air tools when the Haynes manual says not to use those. So he's doing it wrong. I got to give him a thumbs down. Yes, dick monkeys, I am acutely aware that that is what the Haynes manual says. However, if you noticed, This engine is entirely cast iron. I am hardly in any way worried about stripping anything, especially removing bolts. Even were this aluminum, I would have no trouble doing that. It would be a different story, fastening the bolts. And the other thing is I am no way worried about warping the intake manifold by taking the bolts off in whatever direction. So put the book away and pay attention. All right, and some of the push rods actually go through secured holes in the intake manifold. So we're going to have to remove this rocker arm assembly here. And this is going to bring up one of our first details that we need to pay attention to. When I remove this rocker arm assembly with this oil shield here, I want to make sure that I put this assembly back onto the right side of the engine where it came. And while it can only go on one way, I do want to go ahead and label it up anyway, just to make it easier so I don't have to play Tetris with it. But most importantly, I want this to go right back where it came. So I'm going to put a piece of tape around it. It's also going to hold my oil shield on it, and I've labeled the tape so that I will be able to put this back where I found it. So another issue we're going to have is these push rods have to go exactly into the locations where we found them on the reinstallation. So what I've got here is a little gizmo I bought from Summit Racing. It is specifically for the purpose of valve train organization. It's this handy little tray. It has a little, well, I painted it, but a little label up here that shows you where the front of the engine is. So using this, I can go ahead and put my push rods in order. You also want to make sure that you don't put them upside down into the tray. You want to put them exactly back into the same orientation as well as the same location. So that takes care of this side of the engine. But what we're going to do is, again, I want to confirm if we have to do any more expenses, such as buying push rods. What if any of these push rods are bent? That would be an unexpected expense. So my test for that is actually very simple. One by one, I'm going to roll the push rods on a plate of glass and see if they wobble, and this one does not. It's perfectly flat. So I'm just going to repeat this simple test with all my push rods, and of course inspect them if any of them are cracked or anything. I'm especially going to pay attention on these because I know that there hasn't been oil to the top of the cylinder head. All right, there's all my push rods, so I'm going to set those aside right now because we're going to use that tray for the lifters when we get there. Because I've already removed my intake bolts, this should come off, and sometimes these can be a little bit of a pain. If you are working on an engine that is aluminum, you'll want to be very careful because you can very easily scratch the aluminum up, and you definitely don't want to do that on a gasket sealing surface. But I usually like to find some place, here's one right between the head bolt, where I can pry up and break it loose. And there it goes, and then it should come off. Oh my gosh, it's heavy as all hell. All right, and then we'll want to remove the gaskets. Do not reuse the gaskets, by the way, especially on a 50-something-year-old engine. All right, now we can remove our cylinder heads. And one other thing, again, I want to make sure that I put the, let's see, this one is the right cylinder head. So I've got a label here for right cylinder head to make sure if the cylinder heads are superimposable, which often they are on V engines, that I put my cylinder head back in its original location. Now, if you've got an aluminum cylinder head, you're probably not going to want to be nearly as violent as I am with this, but you usually need some type of pry bar or something to break these loose. All right, one trick that I do is I leave one cylinder head bolt threaded, so as I'm trying to get it off of the locating dowels, I don't accidentally drop it off of the engine and onto my foot. So now that I've got it off there, I'm going to unthread this last bolt, And there goes my cylinder head. And there will be a gasket on the cylinder head that you'll want to discard. All right, and the other cylinder head. Oh, wow, man, he's removed cylinder heads. There's pistons there. I can watch this all day, but I've never done it myself. Yes, I know. I am acutely aware of that. All right, so we can see here that these pistons have a considerable amount of carbon buildup on them. And I'll get this gasket out of here. So one of the things with this carbon buildup, and we are going to remove the pistons, of course, it is actually important to know that pistons are directional. So when you remove the piston, you have to put it in the same orientation. This direction is the front of the engine, so each front of the piston must be towards the front of the engine as opposed to backwards. So usually you will see a dot or an arrow or a front or some kind of indication on the crown of the piston. These are so carbonized that we are not going to see that. So we'll have to do some cleanup and make sure that we can see those marks when we do the reinstallation. Obviously, on a budget rebuild like we're doing, I am seriously hoping we will be able to reuse these pistons. That may not necessarily be the case. We are going to do some checks for that. But right now, the first thing I want to do before I flip the engine over to remove the pistons and the crankshaft and all is we have the lifters. And I'm not too worried about the lifters falling out if I rotate the engine over on this model, because I'm sure that they're stuck in there pretty good. But I'll show you some tricks for getting these lifters out, because they can really be a pain. So let me get a magnet here. So in my experience, the easiest way to remove the lifters is with one of two tools. I like to use a magnet and just try to work. That's not going to work on these. They're kind of stuck. Well, that one's moving now. So let's see if we can get that on camera. So here we've got this lifter here is starting to come out. So with my magnet and a can of carburetor cleaner, which does an excellent job of removing the gum that is actually retaining these lifters, if I jiggle the lifter around with the magnet whilst liberally spraying, you see that the lifter will come right out. And that one was actually fairly easy. But it's this varnish on the lifter here that prevents it from coming back out. Once you get at a point that you can maybe grab the lifter with your fingers, if you spin the lifter around and jiggle it around while spraying with the carburetor cleaner, you'll usually be able to get it out. It takes a little time. The fact that the carburetor cleaner works so well is actually a very good sign. That indicates that it is this varnish on the lifter that is retaining it, and not a situation where the lifter is swollen up from heat or something like that, where it's actually frozen in its bore. It is not frozen in its bore. It actually seems to fit quite snugly and perfectly. So that's a good sign that we may be able to reuse our lifters. Although looking at that crankshaft, I'm a little worried that our camshaft is probably going to be cooked. If you have to replace the camshaft, you also will have to replace the lifters as well, and that would greatly affect our budget. So hopefully we'll get lucky. And I'm going to use my tray, which has a handy little location for the lifters. And another trick for getting the lifters out is to use an angled pick tool like this. Same thing. Grab the lifter, liberally spraying with your carb cleaner as you jiggle it around. It can take a few minutes sometimes on these, but once the carburetor cleaner gets on the gum, it should eat it up pretty quickly. See, now I can get it with my fingers, and jiggling it around, it comes out. Some of these can take quite a long time to remove. One thing you do not want to do not be tempted to try to use pliers or vice grips on the lifters, because you will destroy the machined surface. All right, no kidding, this is the hardest time I've ever had getting these lifters out. I will admit there is definitely maybe one, if only one advantage to owning a 4-cylinder car, and that is I would have been long done with this by now. And it's also a consideration for your machine shop. You know, your prices are going to be 50 to 100% more with a V8 engine. Man, this kind of sucks actually here. Speaking of lifters though, especially on an engine rebuild where you've got a lot of metal running through the engine, you've got to remember that these lifters retain metal in them because they fill with oil if they're hydraulic lifters. And I do have a video that tells you how to take apart and recondition hydraulic lifters, particularly if they have collapsed on you or something. So you may want to check that video out. But either way, I'm definitely going to do that on this rebuild if I end up reusing the lifters, because I know that there's been metal running through the engine, and I want to make sure after a rebuild with all new bearings and everything that none of the parts have metal in them, which would contaminate our new bearings right off the bat. There's going to be specifications for the diameter of your lifter body as well as for the diameter of the lifter bore in the block. And you'll want to make sure you're within specifications. This clearance for the bore and the lifter is very critical for your oil pressure. If you do not have that clearance within spec and it's sloppy, then aside from noise and wear, you're also going to dramatically reduce your oil pressure, which will dramatically reduce the life of your engine rebuild. And one final measurement we want to do on this camshaft, while all indications do seem to indicate that we will be able to reuse the camshaft without modification at this point prior to inspecting it. Again, not that I recommend that. I'm recommending the machine shop redoes everything, but because we're doing an extreme low budget, if we really can get away without the machine shop work, we're going to avoid it. But keep in mind, this engine did have very low compression. One possible explanation for that would be that we don't have proper valve lift. And if the camshaft is worn, then the valves won't open enough to allow the air-fuel mix in, and we would have less than what is specified, and that would cause low compression. So the way to measure this is to set up a dial indicator directly in contact with your lobe on the cam. If you don't have an extension for your dial indicator, you can also do it directly onto the lifter. However, you want to make sure that your lifter is completely going up and down within the bore. And what we're going to measure is from the lowest point of the lifter. Let's get our gauge zeroed here. We want to measure from the lowest point of the lifter up to the highest point of the lifter. The measurement from the lowest to the highest point is your lift, and there will be a specification for that. You want to make sure you're within the spec. Well, since I want to efficiently conserve my energy by minimizing the amount of rotations I do of this engine on the engine stand, I want to go ahead and address removing the camshaft first and the timing stuff. So what I want to do is see if we're going to have to get a new timing chain. As you can see, this timing chain is actually rather sloppy on there, but there actually is a specification for this. It's called chain deflection. So I need a couple of things here from my toolbox. Hang on.